Welcome to Everything Casual, bringing you original football casual videos from the golden era of the 80s and 90s, right up to current day. Football away day stories and historic clashes between football firms. Subscribe so you don't miss out. We upload videos every week.
There are some names in football that never made the match programmes, never scored a goal, never lifted a trophy, but still became legendary. Names spoken quietly on coaches heading to away grounds. Names whispered in pubs before kick-off. Names that travelled faster than the teams themselves. And in North London, on the terraces of Arsenal, there was one name that stood above most. Dainton Connell, better known to thousands as the Bear. Not because of where he came from, not because of what he wore, but because of the way he carried himself, solid, fearless, immovable, and respected. For those who stood on the terraces during the late 1970s and 1980s, the name meant something. It meant presence. It meant reputation. And it meant that if things kicked off, there were men around who wouldn't take a backward step. This is not just a story about fighting, not just a story about football violence. This is a story of a working class lad who became one of the most recognisable figures on the terraces. A man who crossed paths with musicians, fighters, footballers, and thousands of supporters. A man whose funeral would one day bring North London to a standstill. And more than anything, this is a story about legacy, because long after the terraces changed, long after the old firms faded, there were still people remembering one name, the Bear. Chapter 1. From Brighton to North London, before the terraces, before the reputation, before the name, there was just a boy growing up on the south coast. Dainton Connell was born on 14th February 1961 in Brighton, a seaside town better known for its piers and promenades than football trouble. But life doesn't always stay where it begins. While still young, Dainton moved north to Wood Green, a part of London where football wasn't just a pastime, it was part of everyday life. This was North London in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Busy streets, working class estates, kids playing football in alleyways and open spaces. And above it all, the looming presence of one place. Highbury Stadium. For local lads, Highbury wasn't just a stadium, it was a magnet. On match days, the streets filled with noise, colour, voices, and anticipation. Scarves hanging from necks, programmes tucked under arms, the smell of cigarette smoke drifting through crowds. And like many boys growing up nearby, Dainton was drawn into that world. Not all at once, not overnight, but slowly, naturally, like so many others of his generation. He left school at the age of 16, stepping straight into the working world, taking on jobs as a scaffolder, learning early what it meant to earn your place among men. Hard work, long hours, rough environments. It shaped him, built strength, built resilience, built character. But outside of work, football remained the pull. Week after week, season after season, the terraces became familiar ground. And as the years moved toward the late 1970s, the atmosphere around football was changing. Crowds were getting louder, more territorial, more organised. Groups began forming, not just supporters, but crews, firms, and faces that regulars began to recognise. And somewhere among those early crowds, a young Dainton Connell was beginning to find his place. Not yet known, not yet feared, but already watching, learning, understanding how the terraces worked. Chapter 2. Finding his place on the terraces. By the late 1970s, Football in England wasn't just about the game anymore. For many young lads growing up in North London, Saturdays weren't only about watching 90 minutes of football, they were about belonging to something bigger. And around the terraces of Arsenal, a culture was forming that would shape an entire generation. Highbury, the famous old ground that stood proudly in North London, had its own identity, its own rhythm, its own characters. And among those terraces, groups began to emerge. Faces became familiar, names became known, and reputations began to matter. One of the early influences around that time was a figure known locally as Johnny Hoy, a man remembered by many as one of the older heads around the Arsenal terraces. Hoy wasn't just another supporter. He was someone younger lads looked toward, someone who understood how the terrace culture worked and how to carry yourself when tensions began to rise. For a young Dainton Connell, this environment became a proving ground. He wasn't loud for the sake of it. He wasn't someone trying to impress for attention. Instead, what people noticed about him was his presence. Solid, calm, reliable. The sort of person who didn't rush forward without thinking, but didn't step back when things got tense. Those qualities didn't go unnoticed. Because on the terraces, reputation wasn't built on talk, it was built on behaviour. Week after week, match after match, Dainton began turning up regularly at Highbury Stadium, standing among the growing groups of supporters who were starting to form what would later be recognised as one of Arsenal's most well-known terrace mobs. That group became known as the Herd. Not an official organisation, not a written membership, just a collection of regulars who stood together, travelled together, and defended their territory when necessary. At that time, football crowds were changing fast. Across the country, firms were forming, groups of supporters who travelled in numbers, often prepared for confrontation with rival supporters. Clubs like West Ham, Millwall, and Spurs all had strong followings who carried reputations of their own, and Arsenal supporters were no different. The North Bank, packed tight with standing supporters, became one of the most intense areas of the stadium. Noise echoed, songs rolled through the stands, and tension could rise in seconds. It was in that environment that Dainton Connell found his place, not as a leader yet, not as a legend, but as a regular, dependable figure, someone who stood his ground when things became heated. And slowly, quietly, the people around him began to notice. Stories began to circulate about moments where he stayed calm when others panicked, about situations where he didn't back down when tested, about confrontations where he proved he could be relied upon. That's how reputations were built back then. Not through headlines, not through interviews, but through word of mouth. And somewhere along the way, the nickname began to stick. The Bear. It wasn't given lightly. Nicknames on the terraces were earned, and once they stuck, they usually meant something. In Dainton's case, it reflected exactly how people saw him. Strong, solid, hard to move, someone who didn't rush into chaos, but once involved, stood firm. And as the late 1970s rolled into the early 1980s, football violence across England was escalating. What had once been scattered confrontations was becoming more organised, more deliberate, more territorial. Rival firms began to recognise one another. Journeys to away matches carried an edge of anticipation, not just about the result on the pitch, but about what might happen outside it. And for the growing group around Arsenal's terraces, that period became the beginning of something bigger. Because as the Herd became more established, and as rivalries intensified, the young lad from Brighton who had found his place on the terraces was about to face situations that would shape his reputation permanently. Chapter 3. The Rise of the Bear. By the early 1980s, football in England had entered a different era. What had once been raw, unstructured confrontations was now becoming something more organised, more anticipated, and far more intense. Across the country, firms were no longer just loose groups of supporters, they were identities. And if your club had a name, you defended it. Around the terraces of Arsenal, the herd had begun to establish exactly that. They weren't the biggest firm in the country. They weren't the most notorious. But they were becoming known. And within that group, certain individuals began to stand out. Not through shouting, not through attention seeking, but through consistency. Turning up, standing firm, being there when it mattered. And one of those individuals was Dainton Connell. By now, he was no longer just a familiar face on the North Bank. He was someone people recognised, not just at Highbury Stadium, but on away days too. Because that's where reputations were truly built. Away from home, outnumbered, out of territory, out of comfort. That's where people found out who would stand and who would disappear. And during this period, Arsenal's travelling support began to encounter some of the toughest firms in the country. Trips to places like West Ham United, Millwall and Spurs were never just about football. They were tense, unpredictable and often explosive. It's in these environments that stories began to circulate about the Bear. Not exaggerated tales, not second-hand myths, but accounts from people who had been there. Moments where things had turned, crowds shifting, pressure building, situations that could go either way. And in those moments, Dainton Connell became known for something simple, but powerful. He didn't panic, he didn't run, and he didn't leave others exposed. That might sound basic, but on the terraces, that meant everything. Because when things escalated, there was no structure, no protection, no guarantees. Just instinct, and the knowledge that the people next to you would either stand their ground or disappear. Over time, that consistency built something far more valuable than fear. It built respect, even among rivals. Because in that world, reputations travelled quickly. If someone proved themselves time and time again, word got around. And the Bear was becoming one of those names. There are accounts from this period that describe Arsenal support becoming more confident on their travels, more organised, more willing to stand up to firms who, in previous years, might have dominated encounters. Part of that shift came from numbers, part came from experience, but part of it also came from individuals, the kind of people others looked toward when things started to turn. And Dainton Connell was becoming one of those figures, not necessarily the loudest, not necessarily the one leading chants or drawing attention, but the type of presence that gave others confidence. Because if he stood, others stood. And that influence mattered. Because as football violence escalated across England, so did the stakes. Policing increased, media coverage intensified, and clubs began to be associated not just with their teams, but with the behaviour of their supporters. Incidents were no longer isolated. They were reported, discussed, sometimes exaggerated, but always watched. And during this period, Arsenal's name began to appear more frequently in those conversations. Clashes, disorder, running battles around grounds. And while not every incident involved the same people, certain names kept appearing in the background, names that regulars recognised, names that carried weight. And one of those names was the Bear. Chapter 4. The War Years. By the early to mid-1980s, football Saturdays in England carried a tension that went far beyond the pitch. You could feel it before kick-off. Outside the pubs, around the railway stations, along the narrow streets leading toward the turnstiles. Supporters gathered in clusters, some there for the football, others watching carefully for signs of rival faces. Because this was a period many would later describe as the hardest era of terrace culture. Not romanticised, not exaggerated, just dangerous. Across the country, clubs like West Ham United, Millwall, Everton, and Bristol City had supporters who travelled in numbers and who weren't afraid to defend their ground. And Arsenal supporters were stepping into that same world. The group around Arsenal had matured by now. They had experience, they had numbers, and more importantly, they had individuals who had proven themselves. Among them, Dainton Connell had become one of the most dependable figures within the herd. Not loud, not reckless, but solid. And when clashes happened, that kind of presence mattered more than anything else. The Bristol incident, trips to the West Country were never quiet affairs. Matches involving Bristol City often carried an edge, particularly during periods when tensions between travelling supporters ran high. On one such occasion, what began as another routine away trip quickly escalated into confrontation. Accounts from those present described the situation unfolding fast. Groups converging, shouting turning into pushing, pushing turning into open conflict. And when movement began, it moved quickly. Crowds surged forward, people scattered. And in the middle of it all, individuals were forced to decide whether to stand or retreat. Moments like this defined reputations, not because of how loud someone shouted, but because of how steady they remained. During incidents like these, the bear was remembered as someone who didn't break formation, didn't panic, didn't disappear when pressure mounted. Instead, he stayed where he needed to be, holding position, supporting those around him, maintaining presence when chaos threatened to take over. Those were the moments that turned names into reputations, because afterwards, in pubs, on coaches, back in North London, stories were told. Not exaggerated legends, just simple facts about who stood and who didn't. And slowly, quietly, the name, the Bear, began to travel further. Everton, pressure on Merseyside encounters, involving Everton were rarely peaceful. Merseyside grounds had their own intensity, their own rhythm, and visiting supporters were always aware they were stepping into territory where they weren't welcome. Journeys north carried tension long before kick-off. Train carriages filled with anticipation, eyes scanning platforms, groups forming before entering unfamiliar streets. During one such trip, confrontation became unavoidable. Accounts describe pressure building slowly, small confrontations turning into larger ones, words exchanged, space closing in, and eventually, movement. It didn't take much for situations to ignite during that era. Once they did, there was no controlling the momentum. Just survival. Just instinct. And once again, those who were there recall that the bear remained exactly what his nickname suggested. Steady, controlled, unmoving when others might have hesitated. That consistency was becoming his signature. Not aggression for the sake of it, not reckless behaviour. Just reliability under pressure. And that reliability earned respect, not just within Arsenal's ranks, but among rivals too. Because even in confrontation, certain qualities were recognised across club lines. Strength, composure, loyalty. The Millwall flashpoint. Few fixtures carried more tension than those involving Millwall. Millwall's reputation was well established long before many Arsenal supporters stepped into their territory. Clashes between the two sets of supporters were often anticipated well in advance. Police presence increased. Routes were monitored. Groups were separated where possible. But separation wasn't always successful. On one particular occasion, tensions reached boiling point. Accounts describe a charged atmosphere, the kind where everyone sensed something was coming. And when movement began, it happened without warning. A surge, a rush, voices shouting over one another. Moments like this weren't clean or organized. They were messy, chaotic, unpredictable. And once again, individuals were judged not by words, but by actions. During incidents like this, those present recall the bear holding his position alongside others, refusing to be pushed back easily, refusing to leave gaps that could expose the group. It wasn't about ego. It wasn't about attention. It was about responsibility. Because in that world, standing firm meant protecting the people beside you and protecting your reputation. West Ham, territorial pressure. Encounters involving West Ham were among the most intense of the era. West Ham's travelling support carried a strong reputation, one that few underestimated. Trips involving both clubs often saw increased tension across London. Transport routes monitored. Police presence reinforced. But despite those efforts, clashes still occurred. Sometimes outside stations, sometimes near pubs, sometimes in streets packed with supporters moving towards stadium gates. During these confrontations, Arsenal's group became known for standing their ground, refusing to be overwhelmed by numbers or intimidation. And during those moments, the Bears' role became clearer. Not as a showman, not as someone seeking headlines, but as someone who provided stability when pressure rose. That role mattered more than most realized, because in chaotic environments, steady individuals became anchors. And without anchors, groups collapsed. By the mid-1980s, the reputation of Arsenal's travelling supporters had grown significantly. They were no longer seen as inexperienced, no longer overlooked. They were recognised. And within that recognition, certain names carried more weight than others. The Bear had become one of them. Not through publicity, not through bravado, but through consistency, presence, reliability. And those qualities would soon carry him into situations far beyond English football grounds. Because as domestic rivalries intensified, another frontier was opening. European travel, foreign cities, unfamiliar territory, and new challenges waiting beyond England's borders. Chapter 5. Defending the Terraces. By the mid-1980s, English football terraces were changing, not just because of rivalries, not just because of travelling supporters, but because politics had begun creeping into the game. Across the country, certain extremist groups saw football grounds as fertile ground for recruitment. They viewed packed terraces filled with young, working-class men as an opportunity to spread ideology and influence. Leaflets began appearing, stickers showed up on walls, badges were worn openly in crowds. For many supporters, this was an unwelcome shift. Football had always been tribal, club against club, but now there were attempts to turn it into something else entirely. And for many within the ranks of Arsenal supporters, that line could not be crossed. Among those who took a firm stance were individuals from the herd, including Dainton Connell. A different kind of confrontation. The confrontations of this period were not always about rival supporters. Sometimes the tension came from within. Political groups began targeting football crowds, hoping to recruit new members and spread their message among supporters. Groups such as the National Front were particularly visible during this period. Their presence was provocative, and for many fans, deeply unwelcome. Some supporters believed strongly that football terraces should remain free from political movements, regardless of ideology. To them, football belonged to the supporters, not political agendas. And when political activists appeared openly inside stadiums, resistance followed. Not through speeches, not through negotiations, but through direct confrontation. Accounts from the era describe moments when leaflets were torn up, badges ripped off jackets, and individuals forced away from certain areas of the terraces. These were not organised campaigns, they were spontaneous reactions. Supporters policing their own environment, deciding what belonged on their terraces and what didn't. The terraces as territory. Football terraces during this era were territorial spaces, not just physically, but culturally. Each stand had its own identity, its own hierarchy, its own unwritten rules. And among Arsenal supporters, there was a strong sense that outsiders, particularly those pushing political agendas, were not welcome. During these years, individuals like the Bear became associated not only with physical presence during rival clashes, but also with maintaining the identity of their own crowd, because maintaining order inside your own ranks could be just as important as confronting rivals outside. Stories from those who attended matches during this era describe moments when tensions erupted not against opposing supporters, but against individuals attempting to use football as a political stage. Those moments were tense, unpredictable, and often volatile, but they reflected a wider struggle taking place across English football during the 1980s. Loyalty to the club, not the cause. For many supporters, loyalty was simple: club first, always, no politics, no outside agendas, just football. And for figures like the Bear, that loyalty was understood by those around him. Not through speeches, not through public declarations, but through actions. Standing alongside supporters who believed football should remain separate from political interference. Protecting the culture that had existed on terraces long before outsiders attempted to reshape it. Because once politics entered football, tensions multiplied. Arguments became more heated, divisions widened, and the sense of unity, once based purely on club loyalty, became fractured. Those who resisted that shift believed they were protecting something worth preserving, something deeply rooted in tradition. The atmosphere tightens. By the late 1980s, English football was reaching a boiling point. Crowd disorder remained widespread. Police presence increased. Surveillance expanded, and media scrutiny intensified. Newspapers across the country ran headlines about football violence, often painting supporters in the harshest possible light. Public opinion turned. Government pressure mounted, and football authorities began exploring ways to change the culture of the game permanently. Supporters could feel it coming. Restrictions increased. Movement became harder. And the freedom that once defined terrace culture began to disappear. For those who had lived through the peak years, it felt like the end of an era. And for figures like the Bear, it marked the beginning of a transition from the raw, unregulated terraces of the past into a new, more controlled football environment. The shift toward a new era. The late 1980s brought major changes to football across England. Safety concerns grew louder. Crowd control measures tightened. And stadium environments began evolving into something very different from the packed terraces of earlier years. This transition affected every club, including Arsenal FC. New policing strategies emerged. Matchday routines changed. And supporters found themselves navigating an increasingly regulated environment. For long-time terrace figures, this shift felt unfamiliar, unwelcome, but unavoidable, because the era of unchecked movement, of spontaneous gatherings and unrestricted travel was slowly fading into history. And as it did, figures like the Bear entered the later phase of their story, a phase shaped not just by reputation, but by survival. Because surviving the 1980s meant carrying memories few outside that world would ever fully understand. By the end of the decade, the terraces had changed. The atmosphere had changed. Football itself had changed. But reputations built during those years remained, and names like the Bear were remembered, not just for isolated moments, but for consistency across an era defined by intensity. The next chapter moves into one of the most defining periods of all, because this is where the story reaches its peak, where reputations are tested at their highest level, and where English supporters, including those from Arsenal, step beyond domestic rivalries into the unpredictable world of European football. Chapter 6. Europe Calls. By the late 1980s, English football supporters were no longer confined to domestic rivalries. The world was opening up. European competition brought new destinations, new opponents, and new dangers. Travelling abroad became more than just supporting your club. It became an expedition into unfamiliar territory where language barriers, cultural differences, and hostile crowds created an atmosphere unlike anything back home. For supporters of Arsenal, European nights carried excitement but also risk. And for figures like Dainton Connell, travelling abroad was never taken lightly, because away from England there were no familiar streets, no known escape routes, no guarantees. The journey begins. European travel in that era was nothing like it is today. Flights were fewer, security was tighter. And English supporters arriving in foreign cities often found themselves under immediate scrutiny. In many parts of Europe, English fans had developed a reputation long before they even stepped off the plane. Authorities were cautious. Local supporters were wary, and sometimes openly hostile. Travelling abroad meant stepping into territory where every movement was watched. Police escorts became common. Groups were monitored from the moment they landed. And even simple journeys through city centres could feel like walking into a trap. For those who travelled regularly, preparation became second nature. Meeting points were arranged, routes were discussed, contingency plans were made, because in unfamiliar cities, mistakes could be costly. Hostile territory. European football culture was different. In many countries, ultra-style groups already existed, organised, disciplined, and fiercely protective of their territory. These were not casual supporters. They were structured groups with numbers, hierarchy, and strong identities tied to their clubs. And when English supporters arrived, tensions often rose immediately. Clashes didn't always happen inside stadiums. More often, they unfolded in streets, train stations, or city squares, places where crowds gathered naturally, places where confrontation could happen without warning. Accounts from supporters who travelled during this era describe a constant sense of tension, a feeling that trouble could erupt at any moment. Even routine moments carried risk. Walking through unfamiliar neighbourhoods, entering crowded bars, waiting outside stadium gates, all of it came with uncertainty. And in those moments, experience mattered. Those who had survived years on English terraces carried that knowledge with them abroad. The Bear. Abroad. Figures like the Bear were not known for speeches or leadership in the traditional sense. Their presence alone carried weight. Reputation travelled faster than any plane. Stories spread between supporter groups. Names mentioned in conversations long before matches took place. By the time English supporters arrived in certain cities, local groups often already knew who they were dealing with. That reputation acted as both shield and target, because being recognised could deter some, but attract others. In foreign environments, confidence had to be balanced with caution. Overconfidence led to mistakes, and mistakes abroad could mean more than a quick escape. Police forces in some countries took a far harsher approach than those in England. Arrests were swift, detention could be lengthy, and legal systems unfamiliar. For travelling supporters, the risks were real and well understood. The pressure builds. As English clubs competed across Europe, scrutiny increased. Authorities across the continent watched closely. Newspapers followed travelling supporters with interest, often focusing on incidents that reinforced negative stereotypes. English fans were viewed with suspicion in many cities. Hotels monitored arrivals, bars sometimes refused entry. Police presence increased around stadiums. Even before kick-off, the pressure was building. For supporters, this created a sense of isolation. Far from home, surrounded by unfamiliar faces, under constant watch. And yet, many still travelled, because European football carried prestige. It offered adventure. And for some, it represented the ultimate test. A chance to prove reputation beyond domestic borders. The risks of travel. Travelling abroad carried dangers beyond confrontation. Navigation was difficult without modern technology. Language barriers created confusion. Emergency situations became harder to manage. Getting separated from your group could mean being stranded in hostile territory. Without familiar surroundings, survival depended on awareness. Knowing when to move, knowing when to avoid attention, knowing when to disappear into the crowd. For experienced travellers, these instincts became automatic. For newcomers, the learning curve was steep and sometimes unforgiving. Those who travelled frequently built networks. Contacts in different cities, familiar routes, reliable meeting places. Because knowledge was survival, and survival meant returning home. European reputations. By the end of the 1980s, English supporters had established a strong presence across European football. Their reputation, deserved or exaggerated, preceded them. Local supporter groups prepared in advance. Police forces coordinated responses. Stadium security tightened. European football became a theatre of anticipation. Every match carried potential. Every journey carried risk. And for figures like the Bear, this period represented the expansion of reputation beyond English soil. Not just known domestically, but recognised internationally. Because word travelled, stories spread, and reputations built over years of domestic rivalry found new audiences abroad. The end of an era approaches. As the decade closed, change was inevitable. European authorities began coordinating more closely. Security systems improved, monitoring increased, restrictions became tighter. Travelling supporters faced growing obstacles. Permits were introduced, movement was controlled, and spontaneous travel became more difficult. The freedom that once defined European journeys began to fade. For those who experienced the earlier years, it felt like the closing of a chapter. A final stretch before the game and its culture changed forever. By the dawn of the 1990s, football was entering a new age, one shaped by regulation, technology, and increased control. But the reputations built during the previous decades remained. And figures like the Bear carried those reputations forward into the final phase of their story. Because every era has an ending, and every legend eventually reaches a moment where the past begins to catch up with the present. Chapter 7. The Later Years. By the early 1990s, English football had changed beyond recognition. The terraces that once defined the game were disappearing. Steel barriers were removed. Crowds were reorganised. Movement was restricted. The chaotic, unpredictable environment that had shaped an entire generation of supporters was being replaced by something more structured, more controlled. For supporters of Arsenal, the difference was impossible to ignore. The old ways were fading, and with them, the culture that had defined match days for decades. The game begins to change. Football authorities had made their decision. Safety would come first. Control would become standard. And the freedom that once allowed supporters to move between stands, gather in large groups, and travel with relative ease was steadily reduced. All-seater stadiums became the future. Standing terraces, once packed shoulder to shoulder with thousands of supporters, began disappearing. For many older fans, this felt like losing a part of their identity. Those terraces had not just been places to watch football, they had been meeting grounds, social spaces, territories where friendships were formed and reputations built. And now, those spaces were vanishing. The shift wasn't sudden, but it was relentless. Match by match, season by season, the old culture gave way to a new reality. The fade of the old guard. As football evolved, many of the figures who had once dominated the terraces began stepping back. Some drifted away naturally. Others remained, but with reduced involvement. Age played its part. Responsibilities outside football increased. Families, work, and life beyond match days began demanding attention. For men who had spent years living for Saturdays, the transition wasn't always easy. Because stepping away from that world meant leaving behind more than just football. It meant leaving behind identity, reputation, status. And for figures like Dainton Connell, the later years were not about sudden disappearance, but gradual change. The same presence remained, but the environment around them had shifted. And once the surroundings change, the role changes too. A different atmosphere. Match days in the 1990s felt different. Crowds were still passionate. Support was still loud. But the edge that once defined the terraces was softer. Security cameras became more visible. Police presence became more organised. Movement was monitored more closely than ever before. Spontaneous gatherings became harder to organise. Opportunities for confrontation became fewer. The unpredictability that had once defined match days slowly disappeared. For some, this was welcome. For others, it felt like the soul of the game was being removed, piece by piece. Reputation outlasts the era. Even as the physical environment changed, reputations remained. Names that had once been spoken with respect or fear continued to circulate among supporters. Stories were told, moments remembered, encounters retold years after they happened. Because reputation wasn't built overnight. It was earned through consistency, through presence, through years of showing up when it mattered most. Figures like the Bear were remembered, not for a single moment, but for an era. An era defined by loyalty, resilience, and visibility. Supporters who had stood alongside him carried those memories forward, and new generations heard the stories, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes romanticized, but always remembered. Memories of a different time. For many who lived through the peak years, the later era became a time of reflection. Looking back on matches that had once seemed routine, but now felt historic. Remembering journeys that had felt ordinary, but now seemed extraordinary. The past became a collection of moments, some chaotic, some unforgettable, some never spoken about outside trusted circles. Because not every story made it into newspapers, not every incident was recorded. Much of the history of terrace culture lived only in memory, passed from one supporter to another, shared quietly years after the fact. And in those stories, certain names appeared again and again. Names associated with reliability, presence, and reputation. Names like the Bear. The shift into legend. By the mid to late 1990s, the transformation of English football was nearly complete. Modern stadiums replaced aging terraces. Ticketing systems became stricter. Crowd behaviour was monitored more closely than ever before. And the world that had produced terrace legends became harder to recognise. But as environments change, stories grow stronger. Because distance creates nostalgia, and nostalgia creates legend. Figures who once stood among thousands became symbols of a past era. Representations of a time when football felt raw, unpredictable, and deeply personal. And for supporters who had lived through those years, remembering became a way of preserving identity, holding on to something that no longer existed physically, but survived in memory. The legacy takes shape. Legacy is not created in a single moment. It forms over time. Through repetition, through reliability, through presence. For figures like the Bear, legacy wasn't about headlines. It wasn't about recognition outside football circles. It was about reputation within the culture itself. Being known, being remembered, being spoken about long after the peak years had passed. Because in terrace culture, reputation meant everything, and once established, it rarely faded completely. By the end of the 1990s, the world that had defined a generation of supporters had been transformed. But memory remained, stories remained, and reputations remained. Chapter 8. The Legend of the Bear. Every era creates its own legends, not celebrities, not public figures, but names known within certain circles, spoken quietly, remembered clearly, and never forgotten by those who were there. In the world of English football's terraces, legends were not made through headlines or television appearances. They were built through presence, consistency, reputation. And for supporters of Arsenal, one name that continued to echo long after the peak years had passed was Dainton Connell. Nicknames on the terraces were never given lightly, they were earned. Usually through character, sometimes through reputation, often through physical presence. And in the case of Dainton Connell, the name The Bear said everything that needed to be said. It wasn't just about size, it wasn't just about strength, it was about presence. The kind of presence that people noticed immediately, whether they knew the name behind it or not. Supporters from that era often describe certain individuals as being impossible to ignore, not loud, not attention-seeking, but unmistakable. Figures who carried themselves with confidence, who stood firm when pressure mounted, who became reference points in moments of tension, and the Bear became one of those figures. Legacy isn't measured in trophies, or statistics, or headlines. It's measured in memory, in the way people react when a name is mentioned, in the quiet nods, the knowing glances, the shared recognition between those who understand what that name represents. For supporters connected to Arsenal during those years, the name The Bear carried meaning. Not because of publicity, but because of presence. Because being remembered by those who stood beside you meant everything. The story of Dainton Connell is not just a story of one man, it is the story of an era. A time when football felt raw, unfiltered, unpredictable, when identity was built on loyalty, when reputation meant everything, and when presence mattered more than publicity. The terraces created characters. They created loyalty. They created legends. And once those legends were formed, they never truly disappeared, because memory preserves what history forgets. And stories survive long after the world that created them has gone. This channel is all about keeping part of our history and culture alive, and a place where we can all talk about our memories. So help this channel grow and reach more people like you by clicking like and subscribe. That way you will be notified when we put out new original terrace stories like this each week. Thank you for your support. See you next time. God bless.
Yo!